the final talk of the 13th Bevan series on sustainable fisheries. There's an entire chain of people who earn far more than I do coming after me to glorify various parts of people. And so I get to start off by saying thank you to the very generous sponsorship, not only of the Donald Bevan Endowed Fund and Fisheries. Thanks very much to Tanya Bevan, who's here for the final talk today. And in addition, the generous sponsorship of the Northwest Fisheries Science Center and the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, as well as Washington Sea Grant. The end of each talk wouldn't be quite the same without such great food and drinks outside, and for that we have to thank the graduate students here at SAS and TGIT. And today we have a special additional contribution of food and drinks from the University of Washington chapter of the Coastal Society, thanks also to money from the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs. So I gather the food and drinks are going to be especially good after the talk today. And then there are a large number of other individuals that contribute in a variety of ways, including making sure that the speaker has lots of people to talk to while they're here. And I'd like to say thank you to everybody who signed up to meet with the speakers. But finally, there's one person without which the series could not have happened this year. There's a good reason why I've been so relaxed this quarter compared to previous years, and that is Iris, the TA for the course. Not only has she taken care of the speakers' logistics, set up websites, and done far more than she is paid for as a 50% TA, but she also took it upon herself to take all of the videos that have been recorded over the past 7 or 8 years, maybe all the years, 6 or 7 years,
2008.
Since 2008, and create a YouTube channel, the Bevan Series channel, and convert them all and upload them all in her own initiative. So if you're interested in seeing what happened in past Bevan Series, they're all up there now, thanks to Iris. So finally, I get to start the long chain of people that are going to stand up and do more introductions, and hand over to Andre Pant.
Well, yes, it is the end of the quarter and the end of the 13th series. I actually find myself, I think of myself as a Bevan child, in the sense that I was looking at the wall the other day and going through all the talks and reading all the names, and I discovered that I actually started here in SAFS literally on the second Bevan's talk in the entire series, back on the 11th of January 2001. So I sort of feel that this is part of my life. However, today is the sort of an end of an era because Trevor has been running the seminar series for the last 3 years after Julia had done it for 10 years. When Julia stepped down and Trevor had to step into Julia's shoes to try and take on the series, we were all a little nervous because if you've ever seen Julia's shoes, they're usually quite pointed and rather difficult to get into. But it turns out Trevor is actually quite adept at wearing high heel shoes, it appears. The seminar series really has developed even more than we expected it to. We've had some fantastic sort of special theme Bevan series in the last 3 years. We had the ocean acidification series 3 years ago, and this year we've obviously had Should We Eat Fish? Trevor is moving on. We've got new and exciting things for him to do. Doesn't involve stepping in Julia's shoes. And so partially I'd like to thank Trevor for all the work he's done to make this series continue to be what I would consider the best series in fisheries management, fisheries issues anywhere in the world. So let's give Trevor a round of applause. Before I sit down, just like to announce that next year, yeah, we're already thinking about next year. Usually Trevor had already had the schedule organized by now. We're going to be doing a symposium rather than the sort of normal 10 lecture series. We're going to be focusing on the Magnuson-Stevens Act probably sometime in the spring. We haven't got the details quite as organized as we would have. That's because I'm now doing it, helping with it. But expect some news on this as we develop. So I'll sit down, otherwise the poor speaker will be the afterthought. Lisa.
Okay. I have the pleasure of, this is not about the Bevan series, but it is a very important announcement. Our own Andre Punt, Director of SAFs, we just learned has won not the college, but the UW-wide All of UW Distinguished Teaching Award for this year. And I thought this would be a great place to announce it because it would be, it'll go out officially tomorrow, but this is a chance for all of us to give Andre a huge round of applause.
We will eventually get to that. Just be patient, man. Just patient. This is how it works, UW style. Okay, so I have the great pleasure of having an opportunity to introduce Eddie Allison. And I'm going to talk a little bit about his background and his biography, talk a bit about some of his publications, and try and best to embarrass him a bit. So Dr. Allison has a degree in marine biology at the University of Liverpool and a PhD in fisheries assessment and management at the same institution. He worked in the Isle of Man and been doing this work in fisheries, and he has a continuing, at that work he found his interest in the lives of people who fish, and it, in a sense, as he put it, fueled his interest to escape the conventions of fishery science. And he's pursued this path in looking at both fishery science and people's lives and the fishing communities. After he completed his PhD, he returned to Africa where he was raised, where he spent much of the 1990s outside the academy working on inland seas, the African Valley Lakes. He then was appointed to the faculty at the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. And that provided him the opportunity, as he put it, to engage in social ecological research with a wide diversity of faculty and many social scientists looking at the lives and implications of artisanal fisheries. And subsequent to that, he was occupied a very important role for those of us who work in the tropics as the head of and director of the Policy and Economics and Social Sciences program at World Fish Center in Penang, Malaysia. And he was able to steer the institution there in doing interdisciplinary work, particularly action-oriented research and integration with rural development practitioners, which is part of the direction of the World Fish Center. He has 20 years of experience in the field of fisheries and has published on work around the planet in the tropics, particularly over 150 academic papers, technical reports, and the like. And I would like to just give you a sense for some of his interests, growing interest in climate change vulnerability, looking at food security, looking at fisheries, etc. So I wanted to just read from a couple of abstracts of his papers. One paper entitled Vulnerability of National Economies to the Impacts of Climate Change in Fisheries. We compared the vulnerability of 132 national economies to the potential climate change impacts on their captured fisheries using an indicator-based approach. So work in 132 countries. Second paper, rights-based fisheries governance from fishing rights to human rights. We argue that more secure, less vulnerable fishers make more effective and motivated fishery managers in the context of participatory or rights-based fisheries governance. We further suggest that insecurity among fishers living in poverty can be most effectively addressed by social and political development that invokes the existing legal framework supporting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So you have a man here who works broadly, globally, and you have an individual who works very specifically on context and linking those to wider discourses, for example, human rights. When we searched for a senior faculty member at the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs, we wanted the best in the world. And we now know that we found that with Eddie Allison. And we're most pleased, Eddie, that you're going to be joining us at the School of Marine and Environmental Affairs and the College of the Environment. We look forward to your talk, and we look forward to you joining us in the fall. Welcome.
Iris, I might need help switching this thing on.
Thank you, Patrick, for the very kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here. The coincidence of coming to deliver the last Bevan series and shortly to come here as a faculty member has really helped me to get to know the place and the people here. I've met fabulous students. I've got amazing colleagues, and I feel very lucky to be here. So thank you to the Bevan series, everybody involved in that. Iris, thank you again for organising my time in the last few days and all the run-up to it. I wanted to respond really directly to the theme of should we fish? And it is one that I've thought about and have talked about and given public debates on before. I've called this talk the Piscivore's Dilemma. And the first question, should we fish? Well, given that after this talk, I gather I'm invited to a very good seafood restaurant, I think we've got the answer to that one, and I thank you very much for your attention, and we've got a bit more time. Which ones? That's the tough bit. That's the one that poses all kinds of dilemmas. Ethical dilemmas, perhaps, that you don't think about when you're standing in front of the fish counter. The title, of course, is inspired by Michael Pollan's well-known book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, which is a history of 4 meals. But I want to focus on one of the sort of quotes from the introductory section. And I went to Whole Foods yesterday, and this kind of resonates with me. The cornucopia of the modern American supermarket and the fast food outlet confronts us with bewildering and treacherous food landscape. What's at stake is in our eating choices is not only our own, but our children's health and the health of the environment that sustains life on Earth. So those are the kinds of choices when we ask, what should we have for dinner and should it include fish? These are the kinds of underlying questions. So the first thing is in deciding and helping you make a choice is who do you go to your advice? I've changed this to preparing. It was who cooks your seafood advice, and I realized that might have some negative connotations. You can go to scientists, and of course that's what we, mostly as scientists, would like. We would like to be listened to. We would like to think that our advice is preeminent in this process of guiding people's choice on what fish to eat and whether to eat fish or not. So you can go to scientists, but which scientists do you go to? Do you go to our very own Ray Hilborn? Or do you cross Puget Sound and go and speak to Daniel Pauly at UBC? You'll get different views, perhaps. And in fact, I'm going to talk about this issue at UBC in September, so it'd be interesting to sort of contrast the way that this is received. We may have to change the message slightly. Governments are another source of trusted advice, and you could go and speak to Jane Lubchenco, although I gather that now she's exiting NOAA, head of NOAA. Or you could place your faith in celebrities, or celebrity chefs. These are our new cultural intermediaries, as the sociologists would term them. The people who can reach us through popular media in much more direct and emotive ways than perhaps government and scientists can. And that's Ted Danson, who fronts a campaign for Oceana, about ocean conservation. Celebrity chefs are increasingly prominent in the discussion, and I think this Bevan series opened with a talk by a well-known chef on the ethics of fish consumption and how to choose fish. And here you have two celebrity chefs, celebrities in different countries. One is British and one is from China. Da Dong is a prominent chef in China who cooks high-end meals for aspirational Chinese business people. And his signature dishes are now Napoleon or humphead wrasse and other sort of high-value reef fish that are retailing for hundreds of dollars a portion. So he's setting a particular message and tone when he cooks those dishes. This guy here is from England and has the very posh-sounding name of Hugh Fernley Whittingstall. And once you've digested that, there's probably no more room for fish. But that's him in front of the Houses of Parliament, and he's run this extremely successful campaign that is largely taken as instrumental in ending discards in EU fisheries. So discards have recently been banned. It's not yet been implemented, but the agreement to ban discards, this is the practice of throwing away fish if it's over quota, or if your vessel doesn't have a quota for that particular species. And it's regarded as, it's a terrible waste of resources because these fish are dead when you throw them back. And this is the kind of waste that the public see when they see fishing and commercial fishing and trawling. And so the knee-jerk reaction you get against trawling comes from the practice of discarding, for example. And so he's run a campaign to ban discarding, and it looks like the legislators have listened. So the scientists have maybe been wrestling with this for a long time, but it took a TV chef to change the policy. The other place that you increasingly go, not directly for advice, but that will influence your choices, is retailers. And the big retailers are making choices about what to sell on the basis of increasingly sustainability criteria. So you have Walmart pledging that all its fish will be marine stewardship certified by 2015, everything that it sells. So just by going to that retailer, the choice in a way is being partly taken out of your hands. And then of course you have all those seafood choice guides. I think I have the West Coast Seafood Watch one in my pocket somewhere. I'm going to use it tonight. And it tells you which things are, it's got a sort of traffic light system, which are the best things, which are ones that are kind of okay choices, and which ones to avoid. And it's one of several schemes. It's run by Monterey Bay Aquarium. There's the Marine Stewardship Council, and there's a bunch of others. Seafood Choices Alliance in Europe. And really, I don't have any direct advice for you on which one you should choose. They all tend to emphasize the environmental dimensions of choosing ethically. So it's an environmental ethic, and it's largely to do with the sustainability of capture fisheries and the kind of ecological footprint of aquaculture. So my only recommendation really is that pick ones that have transparent criteria for recommendations. And I was talking with a group of students over lunch, and somebody suggested that National Geographic have a really good application that takes you through the implications of different choices and sort of throws up species according to what your criteria are. Pick the ones whose ethical values you share. We all have different priority ethics. Some people are very concerned about environment, other people are very concerned about fair trade, other people may be concerned about climate change, or about local sustainability rather than global sustainability. So all these different standards emphasize these different elements of ethical choice to different degrees. And a lot of them have political biases that if you dig carefully, you'll find. If you can live with them, choose that standard. If you can't, pick one that you can. So, with that background then, there's a lot of people you can go to for advice on what to eat. There's a lot of standards that have done the work of presenting the options for you. But we're still left with a number of dilemmas. So the concerned fish eater can ask, is eating fish good for or dangerous to my health? That's often the first question that people want to know before they start worrying about the ethics of sustainability and so on. You know, am I going to get sick eating this, or is it going to make me healthier, live longer, feel lustier, or whatever? Big driver of certain seafood consumptions in some parts of the world is the reputation of aphrodisiac. Can the oceans and the inland waters of the world sustain my demand and everyone else's demand for fish? So that's the issue that most of these seafood choice guides get to. Is fish an environmentally justifiable food choice? So do I have to eat fish? Should I be a vegetarian? If I don't want to be a vegetarian, should I be getting my omega-3s and other benefits, proteins, from some other source? Will chicken do? Does it produce less greenhouse gases? Does it use less resources and less energy than fish, or more? And some previous Bevan speakers have addressed parts of these issues. So some I'm going to look at in more detail than others. And I'm going to refer to some of their work. If now we're moving away from a sort of fish sector and a fishery science understanding of sustainability towards rather broader issues. We've brought in broader environmental choices about whether to use the sea or the land to get our food from. And now we're saying, well, should we be eating locally? Should we be getting food from far away? What are the implications if we get it from far away? So if I eat fish imported from a developing country, and increasingly, you know, we have basa or pangas, striped catfish from Vietnam. We have tilapia that comes from all over the world. We have tropical shrimps from Bangladesh, from Thailand, from Central America. These are coming in. Should I be eating those? Or by eating this high-quality protein that comes from a place where people don't have enough to eat, am I depriving somebody of a meal? Or am I, through my choices, am I contributing to a positive trade balance and actually putting money in people's pockets so that they can go and buy more food? Which one is it? Population is going to come up at some point. It always does when we talk about resource use and consumption. So I'm going to flag this up now, and I'll return to the issue later. Am I part of the overpopulation, overconsumption problem? Well, there's not that much you can do about that, but there is quite a lot you can do about consumption levels, for example, and the positions that you take on issues around population control and so on are also ethical issues. Again, they're much, much broader than fish issues. And a much more specific problem, should I neuter my cat? Before anyone tweets about that, about my wish to castrate everyone's cat, I'll return to it and I'll give you some interesting data on this issue. Okay, so where I want to go with the rest of the talk, there is some discipline, there are frameworks, there are even methods amidst this madness, and there are sources. So I'm going to very briefly talk about those. I don't have time because we cover, as interdisciplinary researchers, we cover quite a lot of methodologies and different research frameworks. So I'm not going to belabor that point too much. We're also going to skate across a lot of different policy arenas when we talk about this. Issues of fisheries governance that many of you here will be familiar with, of aquaculture development as part of rural and international development, food security and poverty reduction as global issues, diet and health and ethical consumerism. So I'm not, again, going to go into great detail about any of these. I will touch on food security because I think my concerns come largely from not the fish that you and I choose and the consumption choices we make, but the issues confronting those who perhaps don't have as many luxuries of choice as we do. The evidence comes from systematic reviews. We've been doing a number of these recently, from analytical syntheses, from case studies, and from observations. And I'm going to conclude not so much with sort of dogmatic advice about which fish to eat and all the rest of it, but with some propositions and principles that can help us think maybe through our consumption choices. The two main sources are both unpublished reports. One is one I did for the OECD, which was published by the World Fish Center. And a more recent one is done for the Rockefeller Foundation, which is looking to invest potentially in fisheries and development from a food security and poverty perspective. So that one's still in press, and we've been given a little bit of money by Rockefeller to take out some of the work and turn it into publications. And so some of the figures that I show you are work in progress for that. The first bit of work that I want to talk about is already published, and it came from a project called Questfish, run out of the Plymouth Marine Lab in the UK. And this was really asking one of the fundamental questions about sustainability, is can the current and anticipated demands for fish and seafood globally be met in a changing climate? So we're expecting world population to increase, this is the mean figure, is just over 9 billion by 2050, within many of our lifetimes. Fish currently provides food to roughly, I think it's gone up since this figure that we used, to about 19 kilograms per person per year globally. That's the kind of global supply. So if you wanted to maintain it at about 1920, that was one of our sort of baseline scenarios. You want to maintain it at about that level by 2050. How much would you have to produce? Is that possible? And how will climate change affect that? We recognize that marine capture fisheries are close to their maximum capacity. There's no real great scope for expanding those. But aquaculture is growing really fast. People often say it's the fastest food producing sector in the world. Actually, it isn't. It's poultry and chickens, which is growing slightly quicker. Because of all the investment in technology and breeding that's going into chicken production. We haven't seen that investment in aquaculture yet, partly because of environmental objections to aquaculture, and also the principle that fish is a wild food, and some of wealthier consumers that drive consumption choices are uncomfortable with the transition to farmed fish. But it's growing really quickly, especially in Asia. So what we did is we set up a series of linked end-to-end models. There was a global climate, global atmospheric model, and a shelf system, a sea model, that essentially coupled the environmental drivers with the physical, chemical, and biological oceanography. And that was coupled to a sort of fish size spectrum model. So you have climate changing, affects currents, affects upwellings, and that affects primary production, which affects fish production. So that's the sort of climate change driver part. And we took the size spectrum of fish and we divided it into two: fish that were generally the kinds of things we eat, and fish are the kind of things that go, smaller fish that go into fish meal. So a bit of a simplification, but reasonably adequate for these purposes. And then we looked at the demand from aquaculture for fish meal under different scenarios, with a submodel called pelagic there. And we looked at how technological adaptation in feeds might affect the demand for pelagic fish, for fish meal in aquaculture, and also at the trends in demand from other sectors. We didn't at this point factor into the model the consequences of everybody castrating their cat. So population expansion and consumption scenarios we used as well. As people are getting richer, they're eating more fish per capita as well. So we can't just use that sort of static figure for now, because we expect in 2050 a world in which not only are there more people, but they will be eating more fish, more meat. And so we looked at whether fish production under climate change, under these different scenarios, could meet demand. And just a brief result from that, and a summary of it. Well, first of all, the fish meal production we felt was under climate change. The model suggested, and we looked at, I think the shelf seas that produce 80% of the world's fish are included in the model. And basically you've got winners and losers. The winners are in the temperate latitudes, where fish production is expected to increase, up in Scandinavia, around Iceland there. And some of the big fish producers in the tropical latitudes are going to see a reduction. Okay, the size of the circles are proportional to the production, and the blue ones are where there are going to be gains, and the sort of neutral and red colours are where there are going to be sort of small changes or losses. And so Peru is the big potential reduction in fish meal according to this predicted model. But overall, there's going to be a small fish meal production increase according to these predictions. The overall conclusions of the study were that food fish production was perhaps going to slightly increase. So climate change is not going to be, according to this model, it's not going to doom capture fisheries. Aquaculture, under plausible scenarios for technical innovation, and this is largely in the fish-in, fish-out ratio, which I'll explain in a second, is probably going to be sufficient to meet demand. So it's likely to produce enough fish to maintain an increased current consumption if the fish-in, fish-out ratio continues to reduce at the rate it has been doing. And every indication, I've just come from a big aquaculture conference where I talked about climate change actually, it's going to decrease. The amount of fish that you need to feed a fish, to produce a kilo of fish, is decreasing fast as we substitute animal feeds, fish feeds, with plant feeds. And if that trend continues, then we can produce a lot more fish without putting the forage fish under additional pressure. And this also assumes that we can manage our capture fisheries properly. And people may say, oh, well, that's it, that dooms it. Because that's not going to happen, is it? Well, again, you have your optimists and pessimists. If you took your two scientists from that first picture, you maybe get very different answers on whether this was plausible or nonsense. But we're going to require efficient management, both to maintain those forage fish stocks and to maintain the important contribution that capture fisheries make. And I haven't shown the results here, but a paper that's going through PNAS, which is co-authored by Steve Hall at World Fish, Neil Andrew also at World Fish, Ray Hilborn and myself, looks at the level to which in developing countries, where people really need fish for food, there's continued dependence on capture fisheries. So getting capture fisheries management right is particularly important in the poorest countries, and particularly so in Africa, where aquaculture hasn't taken off to the same extent as it has in Asia. One of the downsides of this is that aquaculture's impacts could be transferred from fisheries to terrestrial commodities. And this is an issue, again, I think that Ray Hilborn has looked into quite a bit. You know, as you grow more soya for animal feeds and fish feeds, and as we demand more animal protein in our diets, as we get wealthier across the world, we're going to put more pressure on land. Okay, so, you know, this is something that the land-water interactions and thinking about fisheries and aquaculture as part of a food system as well as an environmental system, and that the environmental system is terrestrial as well as aquatic, is a really important way to take this science forward. And the paper is published in Global Environmental Change with Gorka Marino as the first author. I said that we needed to manage fisheries properly for that prediction that there will be enough fish in 2050 for everyone to eat, for that to come true. I should also say that we need to worry about how that fish is distributed. Just producing enough is not enough to secure food security. There's growing evidence that the investment and the worry and the concern about unsustainable fisheries is translating into action that works. We did a systematic review of the literature on looking at where there were examples of working fishery management of different types. Co-management, local management, where communities and government share the responsibility for management of the stock. Marine protected areas that have spillover benefits for fisheries. Territorial use rights, people given exclusive access to particular areas. And catch limits or individual transferable quotas. And these are beginning to work all around the world. There are examples of success. It needs to be scaled out, it needs to involve more and more fisheries, but it's very much heading in the right direction. And I'm optimistic and encouraged that we will better manage fisheries in the future. Their importance is being realised. There's a lot of money being invested in improving management. Getting it right, getting the distributional benefits right is going to be key. I worry a little bit that a lot of the reforms respond to our agenda here in the developed West and don't necessarily respond to concerns about access to fish by people who need it. And you know, that will be the biggest challenge. We're also really moving forward with aquaculture. Green revolution technology that transformed, not always without environmental and social impacts, but it did lead to a huge increase in the production of food, particularly rice crops in Asia. We're seeing that kind of aquatic blue revolution, if you like, in fisheries, starting with tilapia, a fish that's extremely adaptable and can be farmed in a range of conditions. But a project at the World Fish Centre would gift genetically improved fish, tilapia, I think GIFT stands for. And the Asian Development Bank evaluated the benefits as being considerable. I've actually got in the audience a former colleague of mine, Dimu Pencil, who now lives in Seattle. But she had some rather more critical assessments of some of the impacts of the gift, and I might sort of ask her to tell us something about those later. But it has been acknowledged globally as one of the sort of successful investments in agricultural technology. Very high rates of return there for the economists. Lots of people affected, jobs created, cost savings in farms, and a great increase in tilapia consumption in the Philippines and Asia, where this was initially disseminated. So there are successes. So the sustainability aspect, I think, you know, we can eat fish. We can continue to eat fish because we're producing it better and we're managing it better. What about the wider environmental impacts? I'm just going to deal with this rather briefly. A graph based on, I think Peter Tidemars came here to talk about some of the impacts, the energy consequences of fisheries. And this graph shows the global warming potential of different animal food production systems as one indicator of wider environmental impact. And so here we have a range of cultured Atlantic salmon systems, okay, perhaps the most energy intensive of aquaculture systems. You have global capture fisheries in the middle there, and then you have various other animal production systems. And what we see is that both aquaculture and fisheries, in energy terms, in global warming potential terms, are as good a way as producing food as poultry, and better than pork, beef, and mutton, or lamb. Okay, so if you're going to eat animal source feeds and not be a vegetarian, you may as well be eating fish rather than meat. And just to back some of that up, a couple of comparisons. We have the tilapia again and the Atlantic salmon. And the tilapia is slightly less, makes less demands on global warming than the salmon. But the interesting thing here is to look at where that sort of energy input comes from. And most of the emissions are accounted, the method used is life cycle analysis, where you look at the sort of production life cycle of the product and look at the energy required to produce each stage in it. And it's mostly in terms of feed production. So it costs a lot of energy to go out and catch that feed off Peru, reduce it to fish meal, transport it to the fish farm and chuck it in at the fish. Okay, so that's where a lot of the energy is coming from in aquaculture. And so when you shift to plant-based feeds, you potentially greatly reduce the global warming potential of farmed fish. Okay, so I want to move now to the food security benefits and implications of fisheries, having dealt somewhat briefly with the environmental aspects of that question, should we eat fish? And I think, for me, the answer is yes, we should. But in order to understand the next bit, I think we need to sort of go back to some basics of food security. I know most of you probably know this, but I just wanted to highlight that food security, as it's commonly defined, is when people have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. So there's three elements there: enough, the food safety aspect, and also the nutrition aspect. And that's where fish is really important. When you unpack that nutrition part, the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition talks about adequate consumption of micronutrient-rich foods, and they include fish at the top of that list. Okay, and how crucial those are to preventing disease, ensuring child development, and preventing future diet-related diseases. So very much a part of nutrition strategy globally. And when you look at how we're doing so far, the statistics are rather sobering. 1 billion people globally with not enough to eat, and 10 million children under 5 die every year in developing countries. Undernutrition is implicated in about 60% of those deaths. So that's the context that we're managing and governing fisheries and developing aquaculture in, engaging with these countries through trade and markets. Unpicking that linkages between fisheries and food security, fisheries and aquaculture contribute to availability of food through fish consumption. In terms of calories, we get hardly any calories from the sea, less than 1% globally. We get a fair chunk of our protein from the sea, around about 15% of animal protein. One of the things to bear in mind is that most of the protein that people in developing countries get, who eat relatively low amounts of animal-sourced foods, they're getting most of the protein from vegetables, legumes, and staple crops. So their overall levels of protein consumption are very much lower than those of us in the developed world. Their animal protein consumption is also lower, but the relative importance of fish in their diets is often rather higher. In fact, if you look at the poorest third of a billion people in the world, their fish consumption, the relative fish consumption, is twice as important as it is for the richest third of the population of the world. So although people may eat more fish in Japan than they eat in Senegal, the fish that you eat in Senegal is a larger proportion, a larger contributor to your healthy diet than the fish that's eaten in Japan. And there are significant micronutrients. Whenever you see a talk about fish and food security, it's always reduced to protein. Protein is not really the issue. It's much more about, as we've seen in some of the previous talks, polyunsaturated fatty acids, amino acids, but also about micronutrients. And I'll come on to that micronutrients issue in the next couple of slides. But fish also contributes to food security indirectly. It employs about 120 million people, 96% of them in developing countries. Livelihood support for their families and dependents, almost 1 billion people. And it's that income, the purchasing power that comes from fishing. Most fish are sold and traded. Subsistence, so-called subsistence fishing is in fact extremely rare. The majority of catch, the studies that I've done in remote African swamps, small Pacific islands, and so on, suggest that people tend to sell somewhere between 70 and 95% of what we catch. Okay? Complete contrast to small grain yields, where people tend to keep for their own home consumption about 90 to 95% of their production in African smallholder farming systems. So you have also the indirect contributions enabling people's access to food. But it's also through even more indirect pathways, through economic growth. So fish contributes to trade. It's one of the most traded, globally traded commodities. And then there are local and regional economic multipliers, which are scarcely quantified. One of the other things to bear in mind when talking about fisheries and food security is this figure right over here. About 30% of fish that is produced is wasted. In developing countries, it's wasted in the food chain through spoilage, through various losses at different levels. In developed countries, it's largely thrown away from people's plates, goes off in people's fridges, or is simply surplus to requirements. When you walk into that fully stocked supermarket at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the afternoon, as I did with Julia over there, after work yesterday, the fish counter was full. You could have bought anything. It's a perpetual cornucopia. We expect always to have full choice. Whereas maybe 30 years ago, if you got there in the afternoon, you expected to get, the leftovers that you might feed to your cat. And everything else would have gone. So keeping this perpetual abundance means that you have to throw away approximately a third of what you get. And that doesn't apply just to fish, it applies to everything else. And people are running out of fish in some places. In the Pacific Islands, which because of their remoteness and their small purchasing power, are less integrated into the global trading systems, except as exporters of high-value fish like tuna. These red countries are ones where the reef fisheries, which are traditionally those that supply local markets, are in danger of overexploitation and won't be able to supply the population that's anticipated in 2030 with current levels of fish to consume. The yellow ones are where there's maybe enough fish, but there are distributional problems, and the green ones where the resources are big enough to accommodate the expansion of population and consumption that's expected. So in this case, Johan Bell and his colleagues suggested that the implications would be that many of the tuna that are currently exported and are contributing to food security indirectly through livelihoods and economic growth will have to be diverted into supplying local food, or they're going to have to invest in aquaculture development, because the capture fisheries will not be sufficient to support the demand. So those are the kinds of choices and dilemmas that those kinds of people face. I said I'd talk about micronutrients. I'm going to use briefly the work of one of my colleagues at World Fish, Shakuntala Filstead. She's published over the last decade on the kinds of fish that most of us don't get to hear about. They live in small ditches and swamps and wetlands in Bangladesh and Cambodia. And they're very rich in iron. I won't go into the names, but they're basically all the blue things are fish, like those ones before. And you'll see that one of them has, per weight, the richest source of iron of almost any other food. More than chicken liver, which is a known rich source. And iron deficiency is a real issue for many people living on very refined staples with limited access to all these different ranges of foods. And similarly with vitamin A. Chicken liver is the best, but there is a fish, mola, which has a very high level of vitamin A. And it's given to children in Bangladesh. It's known to be vitamin rich. And it's better than vegetable sources, which are often promoted as the way in food-based systems to alleviate malnutrition are often promoted. And fish, strangely, is completely absent from aid programs that aim to try and feed people. But it depends which bit you eat. This is the way that vitamin A is distributed in the molar. Half of it is in the eye. Okay? So you've got to eat the eye. There's more of it in the head than the rest, and you shouldn't gut it either, because a lot of it's in the guts. So these fish are small and they're eaten whole. So how you eat the fish depends on how nutritious it is, how good for you it is, will depend on which bits and how much of it you eat. So if one of these washes up on the beach, as it did in Florida, you know what to do. Okay, so there are technical solutions, development solutions that can help to support this role of fish in alleviating micronutrient deficiencies. So vitamin A deficiency is a major problem, as I said, affects a large proportion of preschool children. And those small indigenous fish currently meet 40% of daily requirement of vitamin A in Bangladeshi rural households. So they're a real major nutrition contributor. And as aquaculture has developed, people have tended to switch to big cash crop fish, carp and tilapia and so on, which are less nutritious. So the strategy that Shakuntala and her colleagues are developing is to start farming these in the ponds alongside the cash crop. So you have the cash and you have the nutrients. Okay, so that's the kind of food security bit that's necessary to understand the rest. I want to then move further from the micronutrient issues towards issues that perhaps affect you and I and that have been talked about elsewhere in this series, and that is the health risks and benefits of fish consumption. So what we've done is we've synthesized all the recent syntheses. And this is a difficult slide. This works better on a piece of paper than it does in front of you. So what I'm going to do is just give you what it means. Along the bottom you've got the mercury content. Okay? Up there you've got dioxin concentrations. And more mercury is bad, more dioxin is bad. So this area here, shaded in red, is dangerous for mercury, dangerous for dioxin. Concentrations that might cause problems for neurodevelopment, the ones that cause people to say, well, if you're pregnant, lactating, you should avoid eating fish. Okay. Down here, you're safe. You can eat pretty much as much fish as you want. Unless you're eating like 20 kilos of fish a week, you'll probably be okay. You can't read the names probably of all the fish from there. They're all overlapping, so I'll pick them out. And most of your Pacific ones, you're down in here. Okay, so you're okay. Swordfish is up here, high mercury content. Bluefin tuna, high mercury and high dioxin. Eels are the dioxin kings. And sardines have high dioxin content as well. And so we've summarized what was a bunch of very confusing tables into what we hope is a rather simpler graphic. Now we've still got to work on some of the presentation, but essentially this we hope will help guide people's choices about what is safe versus what is good for you. And the reason that these splodges are different sizes is that they indicate the omega-3 content. So the bigger the thing is, the more omega-3s it is and the better its health-giving properties, the more reason you want to eat it for health reasons in the first place. And for most fish, most of the time, at most common level of consumption, the benefits of eating them outweigh the risks. So the ones that are really high in omega-3s, you've got bluefin tuna there. There are other reasons maybe one shouldn't eat. But you've got mackerel, and you've got skipjack, and various others that are relatively low risk and high benefit. Taking that and comparing it to meat, this is another sort of rather complex diagram, but we've got a food security index along the bottom here. So each dot is a country. The countries at this end are more food secure, wealthier ones. The line, the red line, is the minimum recommended polyunsaturated fatty acid requirement intake for adults. So if you're above it, you're eating enough oily fish and other PUFA-rich foods. If you're below, you're beginning to increase your risk of heart disease. Okay, but there's something else going on in this diagram, and that is your saturated fat consumption. If you're red, you're consuming too much saturated fat. If you're below, you're not, you're okay. You're not consuming enough. And guess what happens? Up here, most richer countries are consuming too much saturated fat. So that is in tension with the benefits from fish consumption. So if you eat more fish and you eat more meat, the two sort of begin to cancel each other out. So look at the US. Your fish consumption is relatively low. The circle is small. You're eating enough PUFAs to get some benefits from your diet, but you're eating too much saturated fats and putting yourself at high risk as a result. Okay? This is general population. I'm sure this doesn't apply to any of you. By contrast, the Japanese, big blue circle in the background there, are eating loads of fish. And they're getting enough polyunsaturated fatty acids. Okay, so their diet is healthy in general. The Chinese also eating a lot of fish, but they're not getting enough polyunsaturated fatty acids overall. Many people in China, of course, are still food insecure, very divided, so the average perhaps doesn't tell you that much. And then if you go down, the interesting thing about this sample is that you hardly ever get this kind of information for any developing countries. It's always focused on these wealthy countries up here. But there is, in this sample, data from Tanzania and from Cameroon. Now, Cameroonians eat a lot of fish, and they're just about getting there in terms of polyunsaturated fatty acid content, but they eat a lot of meat as well. Big meat-eating culture. A lot of it bushmeat. Those of you who are forest conservation people will be familiar with the bushmeat trade stuff from Cameroon. Tanzanians probably not eating enough of anything. In many cases, I mean, it's one of the poorer countries in the world. High food insecurity, and so although relative fish consumption is quite high, the size of the circle is the proportion of total protein of fish to total animal protein. So they need to increase their fish consumption, but also increase the consumption of most other food groups. But in terms of their risk, lower because of lower saturated fat consumption. And finally, from the health bit of this talk, this is a sort of mega synthesis of everything that omega-3 ever did or might have done for you. So it's a synthesis of systematic reviews. Now, there was a whole series of systematic reviews on omega-3 published recently in the British Journal of Nutrition. So each expert was given an area and said, go evaluate all the randomized controlled trials that have ever been done and tell us how convincing the evidence is for the effect you're looking for. And some of them were told to go and look at neurological effects, some were told to go and look at heart disease effects, and so on. And they published the results and stuck them in enormous tables, which are very dull to read. So our contribution here is not an intellectual one, we simply pulled it together and did a synthesis which they failed to do. The odd thing about this article, this whole nutrition journal, was that there was no conclusion. There was no synthesis. So we had this series of articles with big tables, but no synthesis. So we're thinking of providing one, and this is our first attempt. Again, quite a lot going on in here, but basically everything on this side, there's rather mixed evidence for whether it's good, bad. The studies are showing conflicting things. The size of the circle says how many studies. And over here, you've got the ones where the evidence is really conclusive, okay, where it says omega-3 definitely does, in the case of blue circles, have an effect, or it definitely doesn't, according to the evidence that's there. Okay. We saw that earlier diagram. There's 147 randomized controlled trials that indicate that the trade-off between the risks and the benefits of fish consumption is a positive one. Okay, so the overwhelming evidence is you should eat fish, it's good for you. There's no evidence yet from these types of studies. And remember, the randomized controlled trials and systematic review protocols are extremely rigorous. Some of you may have heard of Cochrane reviews. That's the kind of methodology underneath them. So this doesn't include cohort studies of the type that David Siskovic was talking about last week, which are also very good and very convincing, but this only includes randomized controlled trials. So it may miss positive effects. And when I showed this to David, he said, yeah, okay, but actually, some of these, there is some evidence, but it's from cohort studies and not from randomized controlled trials. So diabetes, inflammatory bowel diseases, and cognitive disorders in elderly people, there's no evidence that omega-3 helps. But it can help with, there's some evidence that it can prevent cognitive decline. So that if you eat fish over your lifetime, it can prevent the decline, but you can't use it as a sort of preventative treatment late in life. So some of these are processes, some are long-term, some are short-term. But the things that you can say that it's good for, treatment of metabolic disorders in children, blood pressure, risk reduction, reducing the risk of cardiovascular disease, treating arthritis, and treating inflammation. Good unequivocal evidence that omega-3s, oily fish, work. And limited but reasonable evidence for a range of other cancer treatment, for example. And mixed evidence on whether it's good as part of the diet and so on, to lose weight. I want to end by reminding us that food is much more than nutrition and health. It's part of our cultures. A traditional proverb in Bengali is that a Bengali is made of rice and fish, it's composed of such things. And that reflects the diet and the importance of fish in that diet. Unless you've had rice and fish, you don't feel that you've had a meal. It's also there, of course, in the famous Mediterranean diet. Recently in the press as showing that if you eat it, the outcomes for your health are very good. My mum's Italian, so I grew up on the Mediterranean diet. Clearly it's done me a lot of good. And I think one of the important things here is, again, it's culturally embedded. It's not just a nutrition system. One of the worries, I suppose, that if this becomes fashionable, is that we'll take the products, but not the cultural system, the production system, the distribution system, the way of life of which this is a part. And I think when we think about food systems and food choices, we also need to pay respect to the sort of cultural origins of food, as I'm sure we all do. When you go to a sushi restaurant, you pay your respects to the Japanese culture, and you eat in a particular way. The Mediterranean diet, take longer lunch breaks. Following the final sort of ethical issue, really, that I wanted to talk about, following from that discussion of food security and health, environment, is the trade one. And fish trade, food security controversies, some of you will have heard about. Has anyone seen the film Darwin's Nightmare? Lake Victoria. It was a documentary that suggested that the export of Nile perch from Lake Victoria, largely to Europe, was depriving people in the region of protein, fueling a drugs and arms trade, leading to cash in circulation and lots of social problems, including increased levels of prostitution and so on. So the Nile perch trade, and trade in general, was being blamed for the sort of the degradation of this Central African society. So trade has its detractors and it has its promoters, as greater global market integration, using comparative advantages of producing and selling in different places, can lead to prosperity and increased food security. So if we look at fish, just two countries, Bangladesh and the Philippines, and the question that people often ask, and there's a quote that fish trade moves fish away from the poor. And at a national level, you can ask the question, do exports of fish decrease the supply available to consumers in low-income food deficit countries? So these are the developing countries where food security, food insecurity is higher than 20% or so. And you find that in Bangladesh, what has actually happened is that the value of trade, as it's increased, has also been shadowed by an increased domestic per capita consumption. So what's happened there is that the trade has actually fueled aquaculture growth, which has then trickled into domestic markets. And now farmed fish are cheaper in Bangladesh than wild caught ones in many cases. So there, the trade, initially in shrimp, has actually not led to a decrease in per capita consumption. Now, one would have to look at affordability and distribution of things before making any conclusion that trade is unequivocally positive, but it's certainly not unequivocally negative. In the Philippines, the story is a little more complicated. The export boom in shrimp and milkfish and other products has kind of leveled off, and there's been no real increase in per capita availability. The fisheries are under stress, population rapidly growing there. It's a more complex story. These time series are all rather complexes, and this is my last complicated slide. And what we've done here is we've taken all the low-income food deficit countries, we've taken 53 time series of that type, and we've done some sort of fairly fancy econometrics, which I won't present here, on those 53 time series. What I've presented here is simply the relationship between export and availability. And what this shows, and these are the sort of the slope coefficients of that relationship for each country. And if you look at the colored dots, basically the ones on the upper right are the ones where there has been an increased export, but also an increased domestic consumption. And in those cases, it's almost always been supported by aquaculture. So that's been the decisive factor. In places where there hasn't been aquaculture, all the blue dots down here, relying on capture fisheries, if you export that and you're near the limits of production, there's going to be less for people to eat domestically. Unless, like Nigeria, you import a lot. Okay, so there's imports in that story as well. And when you look down here, you find places such as Zimbabwe, Burundi, Democratic Republic of Korea, affected by various political problems. So not only are their exports declining, but their consumption is declining and so on. And it's probably things extraneous to the fishery sector. And the ones of real concern are down here, where they're losing their export revenues and their domestic food supplies. And aquaculture isn't growing. And fisheries are not being managed to sustain those stocks. So the picture is rather complicated with trade and fish production. So to answer the question, should you be eating fish from developing countries? Well, farmed fish, almost certainly. Wild fish, it depends. Find out more. Okay, I'm going to end with a sort of controversial bit. And whenever I sort of give talks about consumption and food and development, especially when we're in a sort of environment context, and I come from environmental sciences myself, and a lot of my colleagues and friends sort of see people as the problem, overpopulation. And here's a quote from a very famous book, Ehrlich's Population Bomb. Is it Stanford or Berkeley? I forget which. Stanford. And he's advocating compulsory population control, essentially, at that time. Now, he's since slightly modified his rhetoric. He regrets, he says these days, focusing so much on what he called the teeming masses of the poor, and says that it's rich people we should be sterilizing rather than poor people. But there's a narrative that poor people have too many children, and that's the problem. They could be persuaded to have less, then there will be more food to go around. And of course, that's a huge oversimplification. Our levels of consumption per capita are so much higher that if I've got 2 children, they will consume in their lifetime more probably than a family of 8 Bangladeshi children, unless Bangladesh's levels of consumption rise to meet ours. So we're not all using the same share of the resources. So population is a much too simple metric of impact on the environment. And yet, you have policies that aim to address this ethic of resource use. And of course, the question of should I eat fish is a broader one about how should we approach the ethics of consumption in a resource-limited world. You had, until last year, the UK aid helping to fund forced sterilisation of Indians poor, according to the Guardian newspaper, a programme from the UK Department for International Development, which was putting $166 million a year into that form of population policy. And you have famous papers that are used by all fishery students. Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons, but Hardin also wrote a paper called Lifeboat Ethics that some of you have heard about, arguing against food aid and giving nurture to the world's poor. And you have the issue of Malthusian overfishing, which has been brought into the fishing literature. So population is a very pervasive thing, and I thought I should mention it. And that brings me back, of course, to the cats. So you can lower the demand, the human demand for fish, with very strict management of resources. That means only the rich can afford it. Okay? You can support coercive birth control to reduce the number of fish eaters, or you can kill or castrate the family cat. And that's a lol cat, I think. And you're getting good youth culture. And I think that's called kitty speak. I didn't think it was English at first, but apparently it is. The point here, look at this, Australians and their cats. Australian humans eat around 11 kilos of fish per capita per year. Australian cats eat rather more. So who are you going to neuter? I go for the Australian human. Some of my best friends are Australian. The data that underlies that, well, domestic cats apparently consume 6% of the fish meal that's produced. Okay, so that's 2.5 million tons of fish are eaten by domestic cats. Okay, so when you're thinking about ethical choices and consumption and limits to how much fish can be produced and eaten, don't forget your cat. We've pulled in a lot of different issues in this ethical choice framework, and we're working with a whole group of people across Asia and the European Union to develop a sustainable ethic aquatic trade index that will help people make decisions about this based on an understanding of how fish fits, fish safety issues, the demands on the environment of different fish production systems, the distributional benefits, the welfare and ethics issues around different farming and fishing systems, and the kind of quality issues. So to try and broaden those seafood choice things beyond just worrying about the sustainability of fish stocks to also worrying about the people and the wider environment. It's a bit ambitious, but as a conceptual tool, as a way to sort of integrate some of the things I've been talking about, I think it's quite promising and will hopefully make people think. And hopefully that's what I've made you do today in this rather rapid tour. I want to thank my research team. Dennis and Anne have worked hard with me over the last year or so on some of this stuff and pulling these syntheses together. We've been supported by Rockefeller, OECD, and through the institutes that I've been working with a lot over the last decade or so. And just in conclusion then, I think, well, when we think about governing fisheries and aquaculture, we need to add ethics to economics and ecology in our decision framework. We need to think about who this fish is for, who it can benefit most, what the choices mean for different groups of people. And fisheries and aquaculture can be environmentally sustainable sources of human food. They're good environmental sources of food, and I think you should enjoy your fish, as I will enjoy my fish dinner, without a side order of guilt. And fish and seafood health benefits. It's good for you as well. So not only will I feel not guilty, but I will also feel super healthy. They outweigh the consumption risks. Except if I get paralytic shellfish poisoning or sigma-teratoxin or some of the other things. Okay, so there are risks. And fish is globally traded. That's the system we're in. We're not going to change it, I don't think. We can support it, or we can argue against it. I think we need to look at it carefully. And it can bring benefits for food security if trade is well governed. And systems that govern trade well, fair trade schemes and so on, can really help with this. And finally, you can keep your cat. I'm not going to castrate it. I'm not going to come around to your place and kill it. If you promise to read the population people with a very critical eye. Okay, thanks very much.
We're running a little late, so maybe there's time for one question, and then I urge you to come and grab hold of any afterwards. Time for one question.
Back to Australia. What does this say?
referenced the MSC and Monterey sorts of choice cards at the outset, and people created them as sort of environmentally based in their process. And then at the end you have a really quick slide of sustainable, ethical, and the implication of many more variables that will be fed into that. Do you expect the outcome to be much different in terms of taxa and categories and view of their appropriateness?
One example, the Monterey one, for example, has tilapia on it. Tilapia farmed in the US is a good choice. Tilapia farmed in Central America is a kind of okay choice. And tilapia farmed in Asia is a bad choice and should be avoided. I had a look at the reasons for that, and it wasn't that easy to find out. It may have been to do with perceived higher transport costs and energy to do with transporting it from further away. But if you look at the energy efficiency of the production system using the life cycle costing, you might find that the Asian system was in overall terms, more energetically efficient. We had this issue with lamb imports in the UK, where New Zealand was showing that their lamb was produced with lower carbon footprint and sold in the UK than UK local lamb was, because the embedded carbon cost of transport was such a tiny proportion of the overall production costs, and the difference in intensity of the systems was the decisive factor. So it could be something like that. You know, and then the others are choices, I think, about do you want to support Asian farmers? Do you want to support local tilapia farmers? And I think those are up to individuals. There's no good and bad. And so you look at what your secret advice is based on and make your choices.
Well, it's been an absolute privilege to have such a superb way to end the series. Please join us for live reception afterwards.